An appeals court heard arguments Wednesday over whether or not to allow Texas to enforce its immigration law known as SB4. The measure remains blocked hours after the Supreme Court let it go into effect. For more analysis, let's bring in CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, it's good to be back with you again. Is this yo-yoing of this SB4, is that the system working, or is something funny happening here?
I would offer that the system working is maintaining the status quo while the appeals process plays out. And it's fairly clear what maintaining the status quo is here. It's saying that Texas's law should not be implemented. And so I don't know if it's the system failing. I think there were some strange things about this particular case. And actually, Justice Amy Coney Barrett mentioned this yesterday, although it seems like ancient history in this case. But yesterday, when the Supreme Court decided that the law could go into effect before the Fifth Circuit said, no, actually, wait, hold up a minute. But this is unusual. Typically, an appeals process goes through. One judge says, you know what, let's pause the law while the appeals process plays out. And everyone generally agrees.
So did the Supreme Court shank it? I mean, is the Fifth Circuit saying, no, you misruled on this, or how should we read that?
So I think we should read the Fifth Circuit as scrambling, because part of what I mentioned when I talked about Justice Amy Coney Barrett is she said, I don't think that we should prevent Texas's law from going into effect, in part because we're talking about one type of administrative stay, not a different type of temporary stay. And I know for everybody at home, this sounds like such legalese. We're talking about one type of pause as opposed to a different type of pause. And why should that make a difference? And that's frankly exactly what Justice Sonia Sotomayor and Justice Kagan said in separate dissents. They said, why should that make any difference? So I think the Fifth Circuit, maybe in part, looked at those opinions, again, by a conservative justice. Justice Amy Coney Barrett was joined by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, by all the liberal justices, and realized that they need to really move on what they're going to do while this case plays out. Are they going to impose the typical type of stay? And for what reasons? And as we saw today, will it be over all of the law or just part of the law?
On Wednesday, during a hearing on Wednesday, the appeals court judge said, quote, that she doesn't understand the law totally. And the Texas Solicitor General also said he wasn't entirely sure how the courts would interpret the law. What's happening there?
That was a justice on the Fifth Circuit who was appointed by George W. Bush, pushing the Texas Solicitor General to say, tell me how this is really going to work. And him having to admit after a number of different questions that he really doesn't know. Now, what he said is, I don't know because the law hasn't been enforced yet, because it's always been paused. But I think the judge's point here was, but don't you need to know because you want this law to go into effect? Part of what the Solicitor General just kept saying, generally speaking, was, well, Texas has the right to defend itself. That's not enough when we're talking about potential violations of the Supremacy Clause, when we're talking about an area, immigration, where we have understood, not just based on the text of the Constitution, but based on recent precedent, that this is the purview of the federal government, not for the states.
And finally, that's what the Justice Department is saying. And it's not just an abstract constitutional notion. It's because the federal government is engaged in international arrangements and diplomacy that are affected by immigration policy.
That's exactly right. So what the court not that long ago said in a case out of Arizona that brought up very similar issues, where Arizona was trying to pass a law that was somewhat like Texas's, where it wasn't necessarily at odds with what the federal government was doing. In fact, it was quite consistent. What the court said here is because this deals with Congress striking a delicate balance between what we want at home and how we want to conduct foreign relations, this is a place where we have to speak with one voice. Even when a state wants to say the same thing, we can't let them on a playing field. Imagine a tennis court. The federal government has reserved this court, and Texas and any other state cannot play on this court. And that's really what the Department of Justice is saying here.
Excellent. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson, thank you so much. Wonderful as always.